The annual meeting of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank is an event for economists around the world, bank governors, policy makers, so many people to actually gauge where the global economy stands, what are some of the key challenges. India has always had a huge presence over here. This time, of course, there's the entire Israel-Hamas war, which is broken out just a couple of days back, and that will, of course, have some sort of a bearing on what eventually takes place. We've got a very special guest with us. We know him as India's former chief economic advisor, but now he's executive director at the IMF, Krishnamurthy Subramanian. Thanks very much for being with us.
My pleasure, Vishnu.
I must ask you the news development first and how the IMF looks at it. There is a huge war. The prospects are unfavorable for the world. Everyone wants peace. How is the IMF looking at it? How are you looking at this?
So Vishnu, even before this incident, the global economy was facing uncertainties because of the excessive fiscal spending before the war. Then the war, the Ukraine war, created a lot of problems on the commodity front. I think this event particularly adds uncertainty. It's too early at this point in time, it's just a few days. And if you look at even the assessments that had been made in the World Economic Outlook or the Financial Stability Report, those were before this incident. So my sense is that this definitely adds significantly to the uncertainty. As it is, if we look at the World Economic Outlook, growth is projected to slow down this year and the next year. And I think this uncertainty will not help in that front.
We have great plans and ambitions for an economic corridor which runs across the Middle East, eventually ends up in Israel. Is that something which might be impacted as a result of, for example, some of the statements made by Qatar and certainly Saudi Arabia?
So as I said, these are still early days. There's undoubtedly some uncertainty. But if we go by the Delhi Declaration, you would recall that it was felt almost impossible to bring a consensus amidst the war, and yet India managed with its very, very able leadership in bringing that consensus. And if you think about leadership as coming up with solutions to very difficult problems, I think India has already demonstrated it. So I have the full confidence that even this particular situation, solutions will be found. And, while it is early days, I actually remain confident that there'll be many solutions that will be brought up to this.
Yeah. Let's talk about the World Economic Report. And, it's good news in a sense for India as well. 0.2% GDP growth rate hike is what has been projected by the IMF at 6.3%. Significantly, India shines while so many other developing countries don't. So we are an outlier, but that outlier is based on sound financials.
Yes, and sound macro fundamentals. Right. You would recall we had these discussions when I was in North Block, and you would remember at that time when very few believed that the Indian economy would get out of the pandemic, in a very, very strong position. Possibly you also didn't believe what I said at that point in time. But I think, now the actual evidence is testimony to what we had assessed at that time. It is because we identified the crisis very correctly, and possibly the only country to have identified the COVID crisis as a big supply side shock, and therefore implemented supply side reforms, and were very careful in making sure that the demand side measures were very, very sharply targeted. As a result, we really achieved the maximum bang for the buck. So we were able to take care of those that were affected while also at the same time taking care of supply side and thereby reducing inflation and the macro fundamentals. So if we contrast even with the global financial crisis, clearly it's like, black and white, the differences. So India is in a very strong position both with respect to growth and macro fundamentals because of the visionary steps that were taken at that time, the correct diagnosis of the crisis. And I think going forward, I actually expect India to be the largest, the fastest growing economy, not just maybe in the next few years, but going forward possibly over a 10-year period as well.
Yeah. This comes at a time when there are lots of problems, and the report actually identifies, for example, it's identified extreme weather events as well.
Yes.
It's asserted its concerns as far as inflation is concerned.
Yeah.
It is also spoken about how China at this stage continues to be lagging behind in terms of economic growth.
Yep.
The real estate sector in China is something
Yes.
that they've spoken about.
Yeah.
How does that represent, a concern from a global standpoint? Because in the IMF, you look at it from a global standpoint.
Absolutely. So there are two important perspectives, and I think you've highlighted that in your question. One is a global perspective, and second is an Indian perspective. When you look at it from the global perspective, I think there may be very strong concerns that growth in China might actually be facing structural problems. For one, their demographics are certainly not favorable. If anything, they actually now represent a big headwind. Apart from that, the problems in the financial sector, which we ourselves actually faced around, if you'll remember, 2017-18, and we overcame that. China faces that. And those will actually slow down growth significantly and thereby also impact growth in the advanced economies. But there is one silver lining from a global perspective. Some of the slowdown in China, as a result, there'll be some deflation will actually also sort of reduce some of the inflationary pressures in the advanced economies. From an Indian perspective, I think this is a wonderful opportunity, and actually, I've been saying that the next 20-25 years is an unprecedented opportunity for India to really leapfrog. And with some luck, we can actually be not only possibly the top 3 economies, but maybe top 2 in the world. And I think this is so that wedge between what it means for the globe versus what it means for India. For India, I think it's a brilliant opportunity to leapfrog.
One of the other key points, and this is to quote from the report, global economic growth is falling short of pre-pandemic projections. We are an outlier, as I've mentioned.
Yeah.
How is this a concern for the IMF?
So, of course, slowing down growth, remains an important concern in and itself, but it also means that some of the debt concerns will get exacerbated because, when you look at debt to GDP ratio, right, in the denominator GDP, if it grows at a slower rate, then the debt to GDP ratios may actually inflate at much faster paces. And that is something which is a concern, and therefore, the global debt restructuring roundtable under India's presidency is a very important initiative, and I think pushing on that. Overall, I think if you look at the reason the post-pandemic growth is actually slower is because of some of the fiscal excess that has happened, not only in advanced economies, but many emerging economies as well. Until this, fiscal excess, that impulse of that actually is completely not absorbed, and, debt to GDP ratios come down to actually more tolerable levels, I think this will be a problem for global growth.
2 points. Firstly, India has worked very hard on financial inclusion.
Yes.
And reform of multinational banks. We're going to come out with a very major report, in fact, part 2 of that report.
Yeah.
What is the larger objective which we've stated in G20, and how is it being played out here?
I think I'm really glad you asked that question, Vishnu, because India has definitely emerged as the leader, both in financial inclusion and on digital public infrastructure. And when we look at it from the G20 perspective, the admission of the African Union to G20, I think it's important to recognize there that while there was a lot of talk before, for the first time, actually, the walk has happened in admitting the African Union. And the fact that it has happened in India's, under India's presidency is really critical, because that essentially enables India's leadership, in financial inclusion and digital public infrastructure, which can lead to inclusive growth. For that, those lessons to be imparted and transplanted into African countries as well. So I think when you look at it, combine India's leadership in these areas with the admission of the African Union, I think it can actually mean very good news for inclusive growth in that region. At the same time, if we look at overall, I think formalization of the economy, I think India has demonstrated it well. There are lessons to be learned actually from many other countries, and I think these lessons from India to the rest of the world will be something that will, of course, enhance India's stature going forward.
It's interesting that we are talking about inclusion and Africa, and we are in Africa. We are in Morocco right now.
Yes.
But it is remarkable that Morocco, the people of this country, have said, no, go ahead with this entire summit. You're with the IMF now.
Yes.
And it's all about resilience in this country, which is remarkable.
Correct. No, I think it's very important, because the last thing, anybody would have wanted is, over and above the travails caused by the earthquake, for this event to not have happened. Because as you would imagine, you look at the infrastructure here, there's a lot of investment that went into it. And it was an opportunity for the host country to actually reap some of the returns from investment. And also from a sentiment perspective, I think, so many people, the world's best being here, I think enhances sentiment. It actually is a very good testimony to the global resilience that we witnessed over the last couple of years.
A final question. we've spoken so much about India's digitalization model. It's not just the technology backend, which is obviously the basis of it, but also
Yeah.
the experiences.
Yes.
But if I was to ask you, India keeps talking about this. How does this translate into sharing knowledge and technology with other countries? How?
Yeah, so there are two key points that I want to talk about here, Vishnu. One, if you look at the way in which technology has enabled, financial inclusion or development at the bottom of the pyramid, firstly, it hasn't happened as much in other countries. The important reason is India has developed this infrastructure, through basically the government building the infrastructure. And we economists always talk about when private sector creates some of these infrastructure, and there are lots of investments that are involved here, the pricing of that oftentimes is not at the economically optimal level. In contrast, when the sovereign creates it, pricing is actually at a level which enables universal access. And I think that is a very important point, which will really enable. So the lesson for other countries going forward is to enable some of the sovereign actually to invest in these, both in financial inclusion and digital public infrastructure, and thereby actually enable that the pricing of the use of these infrastructure is at a level where access is, almost universal. That's a very key lesson I think India imparts to the rest of the world. And once this is done in a way that actually that the some of the barriers to entry that are often erected by industry, those are sort of mitigated or removed, then access becomes really sort of far close to universal. I think that's a very important lesson, because you can't have inclusive growth with basically just private sector building these infrastructure and thereby providing access to only those who can afford it at those high prices. I think that lesson is something which will be very salient, from India's G20 presidency, onto and sort of implementing it in Africa and the rest of the world.
Wonderful speaking to you,
Pleasure,
as
Vishnu.
always. Krishnamurthy Subramanian speaking to us about so many of the challenges which the globe actually faces, the brilliant opportunity story that India brings with it. We are reporting from Marrakesh at the annual meeting of the IMF and the World Bank at a time of unprecedented uncertainty. Those are perhaps issues which we'll look at very closely in the days ahead.